Thank you, music team, for once again preparing our hearts well to receive God's word and to enjoy our fellowship with Him and with one another through the Lord's table. Well, you might have, if you have this morning's bulletin, you probably noticed a slight oversight. The text for this morning was written, but it does say insert sermon title, and I forgot to insert that sermon title. And then I said, well, instead of just being a mistake, maybe this could be in one of those unintentional opportunities that maybe could stimulate people's attention, and put it out there as to what sermon title you want to give this sermon, and maybe even do it as a weekly thing, just to give you a little bit more encouragement to pay attention and say, okay, this is how I would title that sermon. And of course, creativity is welcomed, but certainly it must be according to the actual message of the term. It shouldn't just be something so outrageous or anything like that. But the point is, it was obviously a slight oversight. But the title of this morning's sermon, it's certainly not the most interesting title, but it is one that will be the focus of this morning, and that is the meaning of cross-bearing. The meaning of cross-bearing. So please take your Bibles and open it to the Gospel of Matthew as we return back to Matthew 16. Matthew 16. By the way, before I forget, I think all of you, if not most of you, know that we had to, after so many years, I think almost 17 years of having our church office at Miami Springs Baptist Church, another church has taken over that property, and we had to move out because they're going to do some demolition there on that property. So we're almost moved out. We only have a few items to go through out of the office. But just to let you know that we do intend to have AT&T forward our message to a voicemail if you call the church office number. But in the meantime, there won't be anybody to immediately pick up that number. So if you need to just communicate, I think most of you know my cell phone number. And of course, email. You can email us. If not, you can contact my administrative assistant, Amber. So appreciate her help through all of this, as well as all the help that the men gave this past week that came on Wednesday to move all my books to the house, and everyone else who's participated in moving stuff out of the office, not only to my house, but to the storage closet here on this Hialeah property. So thank you so much for that. Well, Matthew chapter 16, verse 24, as we come back to really this kind of pivotal text, as you know already, because we're 1 year out from Jesus going to Jerusalem for the last time, and he will not come out of Jerusalem alive. He will be crucified, but he will be resurrected. So he does come out alive, but in a glorified sense, of course. And we already know from verse 21 that he's beginning to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem. He must suffer and be killed and be raised up on the third day. And remember that idea must has the idea of obligation. Jesus was on a mission, and it was not a mission that was determined by human circumstances, by human government, by human rulers, though certainly they were involved in it, but they were involved as a means of the will of the Father to show his love by giving up his one and only unique Son, his only begotten Son, so that whosoever believes in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. And so this morning, because of the time that we have, it's a bit of a limited time, but but because for a good reason. We're celebrating together the Lord's table. We're remembering, as we even sang, as a sign of his death, what he has done for us. It is our center. It is the center of our attention to make the cross work of Christ before us. I want to focus then on the demands that Jesus, on one of the demands that Jesus makes on those who want to be his disciple. That one of those demands that distinguishes a true disciple from a false one, an actual disciple from just a professing one, an actual Christian from a counterfeit or false Christian, or from a non-Christian. And what Jesus demands then on all those who desire to be a disciple are the things that are essential, and what he demands is essential to being an authentic Christian, and we see it here in verse 24. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "If anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." And so I want to focus on the meaning of cross-bearing because of what we're focused on this morning, what the Lord did for us, dying for us, celebrating that, remembering that, proclaiming that. And then come back around to this text and to the other verses that follow it to really then see what does this mean with all the other demands that he gives as to what a disciple is. How does he live? What does the life of this disciple look like? How is he or she distinguished? And so in order to understand that, we must understand that phrase there, that description that Jesus gives, take up his cross. We sang it this morning. But what does it mean? What is involved in it? What is the meaning of cross-bearing? Of course, we know that Christ will take up his cross and be crucified on a cross. At this time in the chronology of the passage, Jesus began to instruct that he has his mission, and that he must fulfill it. His mission is to be crucified, is to take his cross literally, take up his cross literally, and be hung on it, to be nailed on it. Now the question for us this morning then is, what did Jesus mean when he said this to not only his disciples, but in the context, if you bring in the context of the other synoptic gospels, the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Luke, it says that now he's speaking to the multitudes. So Matthew is focusing here on the disciples as the audience, because the focus is what distinguishes a disciple from a non-disciple, or a true disciple from a false one, from one who just desires and professes. And so it's so important to understand that as we are professing Christians. And most of us, if not all of us, are walking with the Lord, but we are challenged and we are tempted to go our own way. And so we must understand what it means to be a disciple, to being a disciple, not becoming one, but being one. And I'll explain that more in detail next week. But obviously, one of the essential characteristics of a disciple is that he takes up his cross. So Jesus took up his cross and was nailed to it. So taking up his cross and being nailed to it is literal. What did he want the multitudes and particularly his disciples and those who desire to be his disciples to understand? To understand that to take up one's cross is to take the cross literally, to take it up literally. If that is the case, there's a couple of ways of understanding that. One, that Jesus demands his disciples either to be martyred. In other words, he demands that his disciples be martyred. If anyone wishes to be his disciple, if anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself and what? And be martyred. Particularly by crucifixion. Since Jesus' cross was unquestionably literal, so the cross for his followers should be understood as unquestionably literal. Do believers need to seek to be crucified? Now think about what are the logistics of that. In order to seek to be crucified, you have to seek then to being someone who will provoke the surrounding leaders of the culture, of the society, of the country, or in the case, or at this time in history, an empire, the authorities of the empire, those who are entrusted to guarding the interests of the empire, the interests of Rome. Well, what if a government does not have crucifixion as a method of execution? Or even less, much less, how about if a government does not even have a death penalty to begin with? Then martyrdom would have to come by just by the people at large. But the point is that to take this perspective as unquestionably literal, that is, that to take up your cross, it means that to be a Christian, you must be martyred, and you must be martyred by crucifixion, severely limits its application. And it is meant to be applied to every disciple, not just who was present, but those who would come even later. All of us who have come afterwards. This is still a passage that is very much relevant, and its application is still current to every Christian, to every disciple, to every follower of Christ. If anyone, notice the emphasis, the inclusive designation here, address, if anyone wishes to come after me. So it's not just the disciples at that time or the multitudes that were following Jesus, and perhaps many of them were making it known that they wished to follow him, but everyone else and anyone else that comes later in history wishes to come after Christ as a Christian would then have to be crucified. But again, the application of that is severely limited. Not every disciple will be crucified. Not every disciple of Christ in church history has been or will be martyred. So another perspective of this literal view is that since not every believer will be crucified or even martyred, then the believer should at least be willing, ready, or be prepared for martyrdom in place of an actual martyrdom. That it's enough that to take up your cross, it is enough to at least say, I'm ready to die if that's what it takes to be loyal to Christ, to be a Christian. I'm ready, I'm willing, I'm prepared. And certainly that is biblical. I mean, Jesus already had already let the disciples know in Matthew chapter 10 when he chose his apostles and sent them out to the house of Israel. He warned them that he's sending them out as what? As sheep to savage wolves. I mean, that already implies what? That there are going to be threats, persecution. Are they going to be ready? Are they going to fear God who can destroy both body and soul in hell rather than fearing man who can just destroy their body? Are they ready? Are they prepared for that? Will they love Christ? Will they love the cause of Christ more than their own lives? Even the Apostle Paul said this in 2 Timothy 3:12. Anyone who desires to live godly, every believer that desires to live godly shall be persecuted. So that seems to be built into the Christian life, is the ominous threat, or at least shadow of persecution, of opposition from a world that hates Christ, as later Jesus will let his disciples know in the upper room in that last night, that last supper with them. He lets them know again that the world will hate them. If they hated him, they will certainly hate them. So they have to be prepared for it. So certainly this is a much more viable perspective to understand what Jesus meant here to take up the cross. To be willing, to be ready, to be prepared for martyrdom. And it's inherent in that idea, right? To take up a cross, it's inherent the idea of suffering, and suffering at the hands of others, because it's other people that will force you to be crucified, that will lead you, to be nailed on the cross, to be executed. Even Jesus told that to Peter in John chapter 21. When you're young, you go wherever you please, but when you get old, you'll be taken to a place that you don't want to go. And he was talking about how Peter will glorify God by his death. In other words, by his persecution, by the execution of his life. Will he still follow Jesus? So this description is to understand. This perspective is to understand the description of taking up his cross as literal, but theoretical still, because not everyone will be martyred, but at least in theory, in the possibility, they should be prepared and willing to be martyred. And certainly that is a possible consequence of being a Christian. But it is only a possible consequence. Not every Christian will live in a situation where martyrdom is even a possibility. I mean, let's look at the example of living in the United States. You might say, well, now we're living in an age where it seems like persecution is increasing more. There's more and more of the populace of our country that hates Christian values, or Judeo-Christian values, or biblical values. And that is true. And the persecution may come in the form of more of harassment and restrictions, perhaps even fines, and maybe at some point be imprisoned. But for many years, that was not the case. You could say that there was that the culture of the United States was predominantly a Christian culture. It was culturally Christian. So many generations have lived in the United States without the threat of being persecuted for their Christian faith. So again, the application of this perspective, while certainly has validity to it, is limited if taken, again, literally, even if it's only to be prepared for it. And every Christian certainly should be prepared for it. Again, every Christian who desires to live godly shall be persecuted. Paul said that. So if this is not to be then taken literally, what Jesus demands here then it's got to be something that is readily and constantly applicable, as it describes the overall characterization of a Christian, of the life of a Christian, the life of a disciple. Not just overall, but daily. In the parallel passage in Luke chapter 9, verse 23, Jesus says again, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me daily. The adverb there, the temporal adverb there is provided there that is not seen here in Matthew. Luke emphasizes focuses on what Jesus said there with regard to the time aspect of following Jesus, of denying yourself and taking up your cross. This is not just a whole life issue. This is a whole life, daily life issue. Not at some point I might have to deny myself and take up the cross. No. It's that if you are a Christian, if you are a disciple, then this is something you do daily. This is your life. This is your lifestyle. The way you live is reflecting your actual identity. So with good reason then, if that's the case, with good reason, the vast majority of Bible teachers see that cross-bearing is to be understood figuratively rather than literally, and I agree with that. The most common interpretation by far is that the disciples' cross that he must take up is a representation of suffering, pain, shame, humiliation, rejection, or persecution. In other words, it's not just that you will be crucified. And it's not just a matter that you need to be prepared for actual martyrdom. It can include all aspects of suffering that the Lord brings you under. Often people, and maybe you've used this expression, about the cross that I have to bear. You might say that about your spouse. Well, it's the cross that I have to bear. My wife, my husband. Maybe it's my job, my kids. By the way, I'm using that just as a hypothetical example. I'm not really saying that any of my family members are crosses that I must bear. But you've heard people that, right? It's the cross that I have to bear. Whatever suffering that person is going through, well, I guess that's the cross I must bear. And they say it with resignation. And what they're talking about is the burden of suffering. Now, undoubtedly, suffering is an implication of the Christian life, especially to suffer for doing what is right. If that is the case, why not demand then to be crucified? In other words, why doesn't Jesus says, the one who desires to come after me, let him deny himself and be crucified, figuratively speaking, right? Like Paul says in Galatians chapter 2:20, for I have been what? Crucified with Christ. He doesn't say, well, I'm taking up the cross of Christ. No, I've been crucified with Christ. And it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. To be crucified, or at least the idea of crucifixion, is much more excruciating. But Jesus, it's interesting, observe, he says, take up a cross, not to be crucified per se. And that's an important observation because there is a historical basis to the and that historical basis is the Roman practice of the Roman government's practice in condemning someone and sentencing a criminal to be crucified. They must take up a cross. Even then, if the idea is all about suffering and maximizing suffering, that's the point of bearing up a cross or taking up a cross, and of course at the end being crucified. Then why would the Romans allow, for example, Jewish ladies to give an intoxicating drink to the condemned before execution in order to make them insensitive to pain. If the purpose of crucifixion was to maximize suffering, this could not be allowed. Yet it was allowed to be done with full knowledge of its practice by the Roman government. Because, again, from their perspective, crucifixion was not to maximize the condemned person's suffering, even though it was torturous. It did play a part, it did play a role, no doubt. But that wasn't the main point. Here's another point why this common interpretation, falls short. And that is, every person, not just the Christian, suffers in this life. May even suffer greatly in this life. In other words, suffering in of itself is not and cannot be a distinguishing trait of an authentic follower of Christ. Now, the reason for which you suffer will be. It is a distinguishing trait of an authentic follower of Christ. But how many of us suffer or are suffering, will suffer for things that will also be common with non-Christians? Whether the suffering of a disease, of an accident, of some sort of penalty from school or from government, or the rejection or rebellion of family members, the distancing or the separation of friends, or sinful offenses that come from other people that hurt. Maybe not physically, but they certainly hurt emotionally and relationally. Abuse. How many of us will, and how many of you will have suffered that or will suffer that or perhaps are suffering that, but so are so many other non-Christian people. So again, suffering in of itself cannot be the distinguishing trait of an authentic follower of Christ, because it wouldn't necessarily distinguish him or her as a Christian. But here, as Jesus puts it, if anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross. Taking up one's cross is a distinguishing characteristic of the Christian life. So what does cross-bearing mean as Jesus demanded it and as it distinguishes a Christian from a non-Christian? If suffering is not the main point, though there is a great degree of suffering involved in taking up a cross, even figuratively, and there will be even suffering, perhaps even more suffering for a Christian because there is suffering for the faith, potentially. What is then the proper perspective and the significance of taking up one's cross? I'll tell you what Jesus means here. It means submission. It's that same word again that we've been focused on. It's that same idea that Jesus has already begun teaching his disciples by saying, I must go to Jerusalem and suffer. But he must do that because he's what? He's submitting to the will of the Father. He's being obedient to him. That obedience, that will, is leading him to suffer. That's the main point. I must. I'm called to submit to the Father, and of course, this is his will, that I would suffer, and I would die in the place of sinners. Remember the rebuke of Peter in verse 23, get behind me, adversary. Someone who's adversary-like, Satan-like, because that's what the word Satan means in Hebrew. You're a stumbling block to me. In other words, get behind me. Get back to being submissive, not only to me, but to the will of the Father, to the grand plan that I must do this. By him rebuking Jesus and trying to interfere with him fulfilling or being submissive to the will of the Father and fulfilling his mission, he is being now an adversary. Remember that? He's being a stumbling block. He is being a provocateur. Unwittingly, of course. That's not Peter's intention. He loves his master. He loves his teacher. He loves his Savior. But he is being someone who's tempting Jesus to sin by being a stumbling block to him. Why? Because his mind is not set on the interests of God, but man's. And if your mind is not on the interests of God, in other words, if you can't get with God's plan of things, then you're not going to be submissive to him. You're just going to want to do whatever you want, even if it runs interference with God's will. So now comes what Jesus says to his disciples. And of course, Mark and Luke talk about that this also is, the words are meant to be broadcasted to the multitudes. If anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. It's to be submissive. So there's a historical basis for cross-bearing to mean to submit to the authority or rule, to submit to the rule of one that, to the rule of which or against which one rebelled. The historical evidence is this. One, the Roman penal system required a condemned man to carry his cross to the place of execution, the horizontal part of the cross, right? Because the vertical one, the stake, the large stake into the ground was already prepared. And so he had to take the horizontal part of it. And so the phrase taking up his cross is a reference to this practice. But why did the Romans require a condemned man to carry his cross through the city to the place of his execution, if it is not to maximize his suffering? Well, in the provinces, Roman rule was held together by the popular perception that any challenge to Rome's authority was doomed. Therefore, it was imperative that any serious challenge to Rome's rule to be met not only victoriously, but also turned into a public demonstration that in the end the rebel had submitted. One of my all-time favorite movies came out, I think, in the early 60s. There's a movie called Spartacus, starring Kirk Douglas. And Kirk Douglas led a rebellion of Roman slaves against the empire. And one of the ways to get Kirk Douglas, Spartacus, the character Spartacus, to give up his identity was to basically take all the other slaves and crucify them. And there's a scene, it's such an indelible scene in the movie, where one is walking along a way and you see just a line of crucified slaves. It was to make a public demonstration that in the end a rebel had submitted. Having condemned a man to die for his rebellion, Rome required him as his last act to display submission publicly to the authority against which he had previously rebelled. How? Well, this was done by having him carry the instrument of his judgment through the city to a public place while wearing a sign which said that he had been a rebel. In Jesus' case, you know what was the charge? King of the Jews. That's it. If you remember, Pontius Pilate did not want to condemn Jesus much less execute him, because he found nothing wrong with him. Amen? Truly innocent, as Santi said earlier, I think in his prayer, truly innocent, purely innocent. But the Jewish leadership at that time, who hated Jesus and would not accept him as their Messiah, as their king, manipulated Pontius Pilate to say, look, if he is making himself out to be a king, then he's a threat to Caesar. Do you want to side with a man who's a threat to Caesar? That would make you an insubordinate and a factious member of the empire. So, you know what Pontius Pilate did. On the day of Passover, he gave an option to the people of Israel of whom to release: a murderous rebel by the name of Barabbas, or an innocent man, Jesus, whose only charge against him is that he claimed to be the king of the Jews, and that was actually true. You know the story. And so Pontius Pilate washes his hand of this, as if he could really washes his hand of his own complicity in this, and treated him as a rebel against the empire. Had him carry his instrument of judgment through what we now know as the Via Dolorosa. For the Roman Empire then, a rebel who was doing that, as everyone could see as they're walking with their instrument of judgment, he was now, that rebel, submissive. He is under the yoke of the government. So the primary purpose of crucifixion was not to maximize the pain of death, though it certainly was painful and torturous in the end. Its primary purpose was to be a public example that every rebel ultimately must submit to Rome's rule. That was the historical evidence. The other support for this is Jesus' own example, right? And Jesus' example then, in light of the historical evidence, is then extraordinary, because he wasn't a rebel, but was treated as such and made himself look like he was a rebel, to be made to submit to the Roman government. But remember what Jesus said in John chapter 10, no one takes my life, I willingly give it, I lay it down. Just like no one else can raise it up, he willingly raises up his life. He wasn't a rebel, but he submitted himself to the will of the Father to be made look like a rebel and to be treated as such, including all the public humiliation that demonstrates that he was publicly submissive to the Roman rule. He was just, but he submitted himself to be treated as an unjust man, a criminal. And as we've seen already, the context of the passage, he was determined to suffer and be crucified, to take up that cross as a fulfillment to the will of the Father, to be obediently submissive to the Father in everything. Of course, rebellion was never an issue for Christ, but he demonstrated and modeled selfless, voluntary obedience. He entrusted himself, as we read in 1 Peter 2:23. And remember, Peter's here listening to all of this. He entrusted himself to the one who judges righteously. Even though he was reviled, he did not revile in return. Even though he was mocked and insulted, he did not return back. He just kept entrusting himself to the one who judges righteously to do what? To bear our sin so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. So cross-bearing is submission. Christ's cross-bearing was submission in perception to the rule of Rome. But in reality, it was obedience, submission to the will of the Father to die for our sins. Amen? Amen. So I'm going to ask